Thanks for pressing play on an overview of front-end component integration methods in Drupal. Let's get started. DrupalCon Global. Greetings, my name is Brian Perry, and I'm a lead front-end developer at a company called Bounteous. I live in the Chicago suburbs in the United States of America, and I'm a lover of all things component and component-based. So theming and building with components in Drupal, design systems and tools like Pattern Lab and Storybook, and increasingly building with component-based JavaScript frameworks like React. And I'm also a lover of all things Nintendo. So I'd love to chat with you about the cool stuff you're playing on your Switch. For me, with no end in sight, it's been Animal Crossing New Horizons. And I'm also available on the internet in a variety of different places and would love to internet with you. As I mentioned, I work for a company called Bounteous, and we have offices throughout North America. Of course, that was in a time when we weren't all working remotely. Back then, I was based out of one of the two Chicago area offices, but these days I'm enjoying working out of my home office. But Drupal is one of a handful of things that we do at Bounteous, but I get to work within the Drupal practice and work with a bunch of great Drupal folks who I learn so much from on a day-to-day basis. We're often hiring, so if you're looking to do great Drupal work, get in touch. And if you're looking to have great Drupal work done, I'm sure I can get you in touch with someone as well. So before we talk about how to integrate components, we should talk about components and just component-based development at a high level first. So really quickly, component-based theming is building using modular and reusable elements. So building a design system rather than a series of pages. So not taking a Photoshop mockup and making that particular page, but building all of the elements that would allow you to make a variety of pages and templates. And it can use a pattern library tool like Storybook or Pattern Lab for documentation and prototyping, but doesn't require that to take this approach. And it was popularized by Brad Frost and the atomic design concept, which is a particular way to define the structure of breaking things down into its smaller component parts. And why would you take this approach? One is efficient reuse. You can build these components so that you can write them once and reuse them in a number of different places, even across multiple projects. And it opens up some interesting possibilities as far as decoupling front-end and back-end development, in that theming doesn't have to come last, and you can define the look and feel of these components before the functionality fully exists within Drupal. And then also using a living style guide or pattern library tool with this can help simplify coordination between designers and developers, or even developers and developers. It can help with rapid prototyping. So you can do lightweight prototyping before the functionality fully exists in your CMS, and also can be a source of truth for your design system as well. So for this talk, we're going to look at one particular example component and a handful of different ways to provide data to it. So I wasn't kidding before when I said I enjoy finding ways to slot Nintendo into what I do. This is the container component from the nes.css library, which gives you some tools to make nicely pixelated websites. And so this is our component. There's a couple of different variations on the container style, and an image, a few categories, a title, some text, and a button. So this is a look at the pieces kind of broken down as far as the variables that are going to be available to our Twig template. So a title, platform, and year, image, etc. Nothing all that shocking there. A link styled as a button. So those are the things that we can plug data into. And this is a look at the actual Twig template markup. Nothing obviously all that crazy here, but we have some classes that allow us to use certain pieces of that nes.css framework. You'll see our variables in the template, some conditionals to make sure that things only display if data is passed into it. But again, nothing all that wild here. And then this is a YAML file for the component. Kind of depends on if you're using a tool like Pattern Lab or some sort of design system or pattern library tool. But this is example data that can be passed into your component. So you can see what an example would look like based on this representative data. And again, it's just kind of all the variables that we saw before and just, example data for it. And then we'll also be taking this container component and using it in a grid. So we'll have multiple containers for different, in this case, content types on our Drupal site displayed in a grid like this. So this is just a quick look at the CSS for that. Again, nothing all that fancy here. There's just a grid class that has different rules using CSS grid at different breakpoints that is going to give us that 3-up grid that we saw before. Now that we've taken a look at the component that we're going to be playing around with as an example, let's take a look at components from the perspective of Drupal. So there's a few different lines that we're going to draw as we go through this, but for the sake of this discussion, the first one we're going to look at is where the component lives. And we're going to divide that up into standard Drupal components and integrated Drupal components. So in this case, when I say a standard Drupal component, I'm talking about something that lives in the default template directory, typically the default template directory in your theme. And because that's where Drupal expects that stuff to live, there may not be any additional effort that's required to get data to display in your component. And on the other hand, an integrated Drupal component lives anywhere other than the default template directory. So it's going to require some amount of effort for us to pass the data to that component and get it to display. And for the sake of this talk, exactly where that is kind of doesn't matter. It could be somewhere else in your theme other than the templates directory. It could be an external dependency that you pull in via Composer or NPM. But again, just the distinction here is that it's somewhere other than where Drupal expects it to be by default, and we've got to do some work to pass in data to it. So now let's take a closer look at what we're calling standard Drupal components. So again, this is building using a component that lives inside Drupal's default templates directory. So building using standard Drupal components may be the right choice for your team or project. So here you are building with Drupal and only Drupal in mind, doing things the Drupal way, putting the components where Drupal expects them. So this certainly allows you to take advantage of things that can be easily reused in Drupal and kind of structure your approach to that. Things like display modes and blocks, and you can use paragraphs if so inclined, layouts for Layout Builder. But one thing you definitely lose out on here is some of the potential advantages for rapid prototyping. So you have to stand everything up in Drupal and make it exist in Drupal before you can see what it looks like. So let's take a look back at our component from the perspective of if we were, creating a traditional Drupal component for it. So in this case, we created a game content type that has a number of fields kind of corresponding with the variables in our component. So there's the label that represents the title, and then field platform, field image, the body, the URLs available to the template, and so on. And then when we're using this container and displaying this game content, we're going to use a teaser view mode. So we're saying that when Drupal is rendering using this teaser view mode, we want to make sure it looks like this container component. So here we're looking at a template for the game content type in the teaser view mode. And this is just based on the default node.html.twig template in Classy, the Classy theme in core, I believe. And really all we're doing here is massaging it to kind of fit the markup that we need to create our container component. So in our classes array, we're just adding in some nes.css classes that we need. So NES container with title and is centered in this case, and the rest are kind of default things that Drupal uses for a node. And then lower down in the template, you can see that we're so passing in those classes to the article, and then also adding some additional wrapping markup where we need it. So for example, we have the NES badge and is splitted class in a div, and then we're passing in the platform and year to have those little badges up top, and then essentially passing in the rest of our fields as well. So really all we're doing here is taking this default template suggestion and adjusting the markup to our needs. So that is going to give us our container component. And then as we mentioned before, we're also going to display this in a grid. So in this case, we're just going to create a view for it, a games view that's going to list out a number of games using that container component. And this is a unformatted view template here. And really not a lot complicated going on here either. We're essentially just taking the default markup that would be used in this template and wrapping it in the L grid class that we defined before. And that's going to give us our grid. So now let's look at the integrated approach. So again, this is using components that live anywhere but the default templates directory in a module or theme. And we'll look at a whole bunch of different ways that we can integrate data into these components that live elsewhere. So here we have our component library, our NES components directory inside of our custom NES theme in this case. And it uses Pattern Lab's default structure. So there's a source directory and then a patterns directory that has directories for each of our different components. Not a whole lot here, but you'll see that there's the container component and a Twig template and a YAML file. And we can also spin up Pattern Lab to see what our component looks like, see examples of the markup, and see it with data passed in. And then another piece of the puzzle that we'll need here is the Drupal components module. So this module creates Twig namespaces. So you'll see in our info.yaml file, we created a namespace called components that points to that component subdirectory in patterns in our pattern library. And this gives us a nice little shortcut to reference our components And it also just makes Drupal aware of those templates that live in a non-standard location. Otherwise, Drupal will only discover templates in the templates directory. So now that Drupal is aware of our templates, we need to figure out the appropriate way to pass data into them. And this is another distinction that we're going to use here, the difference between mapping data in code versus mapping the data in the admin UI. And this probably falls into like a mostly category. You know, there are situations where there might be a bit of a mix, but for each of these approaches, we're going to just look at, you know, the primary approach. So for mapping data in code, this includes things like mapping data in Twig templates, various approaches to preprocessing, themes and starter kits. And here, you're potentially a little bit more likely to get out of sync with the Drupal UI, and that you're doing it all in code and can do things like bypass certain display modes and things like that. And you're also potentially, unless you're careful, more likely to break things like caching or Drupal functionality like quick edit. And then mapping data in the admin UI, this is going to include things like the UI patterns module or using Drupal layouts. And it's typically less likely to disrupt Drupal functionality, as we mentioned, but also as a result, potentially not as flexible, kind of a trade-off there. So let's take a look at approaches where we're mapping our data in code. So once again, here's the component that we have, and we're still working with the teaser view mode and passing the same data into the same fields that we saw before. And the first approach we'll look at is doing mapping in the Twig template using the concept of a presenter template. So here we have our node game teaser.html.twig template that we saw before. And instead, what we're doing is we're referencing the template in our component library. So we still have our wrapping article element that we're passing some top-level classes into. But then we're using a Twig include statement, and we have our Twig namespace of components, a little shortcut to our container directory, and then we're referencing the ccontainer.twig template. And then we're saying with, and then we are mapping all of the fields, the variables from that ccontainer Twig template, and we're specifying what fields from our content type are going to go into it. So this really just kind of is a middleman where Drupal expects the template to be that says, hey, actually go look over here to the template in our component library. So just a little side note here, you may have noticed that for something like the image field, we're just passing through Drupal's entire image field. And you may want to, for a component like this, break things down into their individual pieces. So you have to pass like alt text and the source. But I find personally that if you keep things high level and let Drupal do what it does well as far as rendering image markup and use kind of high level slots for the data that you pass through, things will be easier for you in the long run. So this is the same example, but instead handling the data mapping in a preprocess function in our nes.theme file in our custom theme. So nothing really all that intense going on here. In fact, we're doing very little. We're just taking the content variables and mapping them over to the variables that our Twig template expects. So there's definitely a lot more that you could do here, additional logic that you could include, but this is kind of the simplest possible example of what could go on here in a preprocess function. And if you've mapped all of the data and put them exactly where they need to belong, in the presenter template here, the node game teaser.html.twig, We don't even really need to have our with statement. We can just include the template. Those variables are available and they'll be rendered out. So it can simplify what you have to do in your Twig template. So there are a number of tools that can help make this mapping process easier. A couple of helper modules that will help with mapping are Twig field value and Twig tweak that I use pretty frequently on projects. So Twig field value lets you get partial data from field render arrays. It lets you get the label. You can use field value just to get the value without wrapping markup. And you can get target entities. So this really lets you just get at the data that you want. It may, in some cases, like I believe field raw and field target entity, have some additional caching considerations you might need to take into account to make sure that things are cached appropriately. Twig tweak, on the other hand, has a ton of different helpful functions and filters that let you render views and blocks and regions, particular image styles, extract tokens, and many, many other things. So if there's something that you're having trouble doing in Twig, it's likely that Twig tweak may have already done it for you. So great, helpful tools there. So far, we've been looking at a custom theme, but there are also a number of starter kits and themes that can help you with this component-based approach. They do a handful of things for you. One is they simplify setup and often have a opinion about the default tooling and front-end workflow. So if that's not something you want to set up yourself, this can definitely be a great help. Some of them have default components and helper functions that you can rely on. And how opinionated each of these are is going to vary. So in some cases, they'll be very opinionated, and there's a certain way you have to do things. Others are more of a looser starting framework. There's a lot of them out there. EMULSIFY is a very common, popular option. There's Gesso, the Shyla theme, Particle. And these are all great options that are well used in the community. And again, if you don't want to do this setup yourself and don't want that level of control, it can really help you out. Since we're kind of looking at the same example component over and over in a bunch of different contexts, there's really not a ton to show here, but I did create an example using the EMULSIFY design system, since EMULSIFY seems to be a pretty popular option for a starter kit in the community. And the general concept here is pretty much exactly the same. We've got the same presenter templates that are referencing component templates that just so happen to live in a different location. And EMULSIFY design system uses a different component library tool. It uses Storybook for HTML as opposed to Pattern Lab. But in general, the concept is the same. We get to see an example of our component with slightly different image passed into it here, but we get to see what it will look like. And how we define our example component in Storybook is a little bit different. So here we have a container.stories.js file, but a lot of the concepts are pretty similar here. We're using our Twig template, and then we have a YAML file that contains data for the component, and then we're just going to go ahead and render out an example of what it would look like. So different syntax and structure here, but again, the concepts are very much the same. And this is an example of what everything ends up looking like in the actual theme itself. It's the same grid that we looked at in previous examples, just with a theme to start from and a lot of the groundwork laid out for us to begin with. So now let's take a look at some ways to map data in the admin UI. So the first we'll be looking at is using the UI patterns module. So the way I like to describe the UI patterns module is it's a way to define components in a way that Drupal understands. So you define UI patterns, which are Drupal plugins, and then you can use those patterns with a variety of component-friendly modules. So things like views, field groups, layout builder, display suite, paragraphs as well. And then it actually allows you to configure the types of mappings that we looked at previously in Drupal's admin UI. And then there's an optional pattern library page that gets exposed in Drupal. It's kind of like a mini version of Pattern Lab. And it also lets you in Drupal pre-process these patterns, render them programmatically, and a handful of other cool tricks. So still working with the container component here. A lot of the things are the same. The one thing that's different is what we're actually creating at the end of the day is a pattern. So a container pattern in this case, but all the variables are the same. So to define a pattern, there's a pattern.yaml file. It's possible to define multiple patterns in one YAML file, but typically I like to break them up into individual pattern definition files. And so you give the pattern an ID, label, and a description, and then you define all of the fields. So you'll see the same fields that we've seen a number of times before: title, platform, image, etc. And they can have a type, which is mainly used for documentation purposes, a label, a description, and then you can pass in preview data. So it could be text or markup or any number of things there. And then looking a little deeper in the YAML file, there's a few other things that you can do. You can define libraries. So this will force assets to be loaded whenever the pattern is used. So if you have CSS that should be loaded with it, or JavaScript that it depends on, you can have it loaded that way. And you can also use these libraries as dependencies in other libraries if you need to. And then there is the use statement down at the bottom, and that allows you to specify a path, even including a Twig namespace here, to your component template. And that allows you to kind of short circuit the need for that presenter template that we created on the Drupal side. So it's really just saying, whenever you render this pattern, go out to this component template and just use that. So it prevents you from having to have that middleman template at all, which is great. And then this is an example of what things look like in the pattern library page. So obviously this looks a little extra crazy because everything's intentionally Nintendo-y and pixelated. But you see all of the things you defined for your pattern and your field, the description, all the different fields, an example of the component with data. It serves as a great piece of documentation for the components that are, essentially Drupal integrated. So it's another thing that allows your developers to know what components can be easily used in Drupal now. And then we don't have time to go through all of the different things that this module and its suite of modules can do, but there are essentially a number of integration modules that let you use these patterns in some different contexts. So we'll look at the views, UI patterns views module. So you can specify to show a pattern. And then when you do that, in the row style options, you can specify which pattern you want to use. It's the container pattern in this case. And then for each individual field, you can specify what the destination in your pattern is. So this is one example of handling that mapping right in the UI. So another way to handle this type of mapping in the UI is using a layout. So again, our same friendly component here, and we're creating a container layout. And a layout in Drupal, all of these things are regions. in this case. So we've got a region for the title, a region for the image, body, and so on. And then the simplest way to define a layout is in a layouts.yaml file. Could be in your theme, as it is in this case. Could be provided by a module. But here we're defining, the main thing is the template that the layout is referencing. And that has to live in your default templates directory. It has to have a html.twig extension. And then you specify all of your regions. And then in the Twig template that you reference, in this case, we're once again just referencing our component template that we've seen a number of times before. And what we're passing into it are the regions from our layout. So using this layout with Layout Builder, there are definitely some additional considerations. Basically, you need to retain the things that Layout Builder depends on. So for example, you need to use the attributes object, and as a result of that, your pattern library tool needs to be able to understand what add class, the add class function is. There's a handful of ways to address that depending on which tool that you're using. And then also there's certain like wrapping markup that Layout Builder depends on. So the wrapping divs that use the region attributes, as you see throughout this template, you'll need to retain that as well. So you really can't fully strip away the Drupal things here if you want this component layout to be something that Layout Builder can use. All that said, this is what it would look like if we have our container component as a layout in Layout Builder. So we have all of the different regions that we can add blocks to. As you'll see here, depending on the structure of your component, it may or may not make sense to have this visual representation of your component in Layout Builder. If there are a number of variables in your component that aren't necessarily represented visually, that's obviously going to be a problem. Or as we see here, if they're in close quarters, that can even just be a problem. But there certainly will be components where this approach could work really nicely. So we touched on a lot of the potential challenges with this approach, but you do need to retain all the things that Layout Builder depends on if you want to expose your component as a layout and use it with Layout Builder. And your pattern library needs to be able to understand those things, the attributes objects, some of the related functions. And your component may not make sense to represent visually in this way. And finally, Layout Builder is going to introduce some additional markup and a number of additional wrapping divs. So depending on how your component is structured, that may also conflict with your component and its display. So a lot of proceed with caution type things here with this approach. So now let's look at the distinction as far as how the component is defined. So in all the examples that we looked at so far, there was some level of manual definition of the component. So we had to define things in code so that Drupal could become aware of it. There's also the emerging concept of automatic discovery. So in that case, a Drupal module is going to automatically discover the things from your component library and make them available to Drupal. So from the manual definition perspective, it often is going to require some amount of duplication between the things in Drupal and your component library. It might be a YAML file that has a lot of the same field definitions. It might be that presenter template that really just exists to stand in the middle and direct traffic. So automatic discovery has those advantages in that you don't necessarily have to be defining things twice. However, on the flip side, most of the approaches that have been developed so far require a particular convention, which means that they likely won't work with all component libraries and may also, favor certain approaches. So let's look at some cases where automatic discovery is possible. The first is the UI Patterns Pattern Lab module. So this module will automatically create UI patterns from your Pattern Lab instance. So for a lot of these examples, the end result is the same because it's just going to generate the component that we've seen a number of times before. But obviously the fact that it is making it available to Drupal automatically is the interesting part here. It's not necessary to create a additional and redundant UI patterns.yaml file if you're using this module. But there are some limitations and expectations here. So it requires there to be a YAML file or JSON file with pattern data. That's how this module picks up on what the fields are supposed to be. It requires things to be named in a particular way. So the same file name needs to be used for your data definition, your Twig templates, assets that you're using. And also it requires a particular approach to nested components here to be able to include things inside of each other. But the fact that it can look at your Pattern Lab instance and automatically make those things available to Drupal is a pretty interesting and cool concept. And then following through on a similar concept is the layouts from Pattern Lab module. And this is another module that I maintain. I'd say this one is definitely much earlier and also probably on the line of, at this point, possibly a failed experiment. But, worth talking about what was attempted here. And, it is something that's still available for people to experiment with and build on. This is the same sort of idea in that it will take things defined in a Pattern Lab instance and expose them as layouts in Drupal. And you don't have to explicitly define the layouts in code. They can be used with Layout Builder. It also allows you to specify whether or not the default field wrapper or just the content will be used when rendering the data, similar to what UI Patterns does. But it has even more limitations at the moment. For the most recent version of Pattern Lab, at least somewhat recently, it wasn't working with the html.twig extension, which Layout Builder requires, or Drupal layouts require for their templates. So there has to be some working around to make that work. And also, if you are stripping away the wrapping markup, you're going to run into issues with things like Layout Builder's drag and drop. So you need to be careful there. But again, another interesting way that we can expose automatically things from your pattern library or design system in Drupal. So lastly, in the automatic discovery area, to look at a module that is thankfully not maintained by me, is the PatternKit module, which I believe is maintained by the folks at Red Hat. And this kind of combines aspects of manual definition and automatic discovery, in that it depends on a schema definition file. And that schema definition file, it uses JSON schema, has potentially some applications outside of Drupal as well. But at the end of the day, it derives blocks from your pattern library components, which you can use in the Blocks UI or in Layout Builder. It supports a particular set of field types. And then also there's a Drupal 7 and a Drupal 8 version of the module. The last I looked at the D8 version, it didn't have support for tokens, but I believe that was something that was being worked on. So as far as defining patterns for PatternKit in your libraries.yaml file here, you can create a pattern section. that is just referencing the location of your patterns, and in this case, stating that it should be expecting Twig templates. And then that component needs to have a JSON file, as we mentioned here, following JSON schema. Most of what's happening here in the property section is the fields are being defined and also specifying, what type of field it is. There's also a lot that you can do as far as defining settings for the component that can then later be configured in the Blocks UI. So here's an example of what the end result looks like in the block UI after you've defined your PATTERNKIT pattern. There are all the fields that we specified and the settings, which can all be configured, and will give you the end result of our container component. So one last piece of the puzzle that we'll talk about quickly are prepackaged component solutions. One example is the Bolt design system, which provides a number of ready-to-use web components that you can use with Drupal. And it's a full design system, and it also lets you selectively require individual components. So definitely worth checking out if you haven't, but one really fully featured, interesting way that you can pick and choose components that you need for your project. Similarly, there's also the Compony project, which is a kind of a system for distributing components. It has a theme and a gulp workflow and a series of components that you can download. It's not composer or NPM driven, at least last I looked into this, which from my perspective is a limitation because that's an important part of my workflow. But again, this concept of being able to distribute components that you can use easily with Drupal is compelling. And then there's also the single file components module, which is a little bit different from the examples we've seen thus far. It allows you to define Drupal components in a view style single file definition. So you can then use that like any template. It can generate library definitions, and you can derive blocks. It doesn't exactly solve the integration problem that we've been talking about, but it definitely does provide an interesting way to package and reuse these components that can be made available to Drupal. So finally, just to wrap up, let's touch on the workflow a little bit. So my dream workflow is really something similar to the experience you can have in React or other similar JavaScript frameworks, where there are a variety of fully packaged and distributed components that you can easily install, and then go ahead and import them in code and pass the data that you need into them and use them as you see fit. So the question for me is, how could we get there within Drupal? And it really feels like we have a lot of the pieces, but just don't have the kind of formal approach locked down quite yet. So I think that it'd be great for us to continue to improve the process for defining these mappings and definitions in the Drupal user interface, specifically focusing on Layout Builder. I think it's important that it become easier to package and distribute individual components. And I also think that some of the evolving approaches of ways for Drupal to automatically discover components is worth continuing to invest in. And then also, it's, I think, worthwhile to continue following the evolution of web components, as they might also be an attractive solution to this problem. But most importantly, we just need to keep building great looking component-based sites using Drupal and sharing our knowledge. So I also just want to send a quick thanks and shout out to the many contributors to the Drupal component ecosystem. Those who have created and contributed to the modules and approaches that I've talked about today, those who've shared their knowledge. There's amazing work being done that I've benefited from so much, and happy to share some of my learnings and be a small part of it. So thanks to everybody who has remotely watched this presentation. Hope to catch up with you online and hear more about what you're doing in the component space.